For years, investors feared recessions. But there's something worse. An economy where growth slows, jobs disappear, and prices still keep rising. That's stagflation. And unlike a normal recession, there's no easy solution. Cut rates. Inflation gets worse. Raise rates. The economy breaks even harder. Hello everyone, my name is Ledger. And today, we're breaking down the difference between recession and stagflation, and why understanding that difference matters more than most investors realize. These two words get thrown around constantly. Recession, stagflation. Financial media talks about them almost every day. Analysts debate them endlessly. Politicians blame each other for them. And yet most people still treat them like they mean the same thing. They don't. In reality, they describe two very different economic environments. And confusing one for the other can lead investors, governments, and central banks into extremely dangerous decisions. Because while both involve economic pain, the mechanics underneath them are completely different. And more importantly, the policies that help solve one problem can make the other dramatically worse. So let's start with the simpler one. A recession is what happens when the economic engine begins slowing down. Consumers spend less money. Businesses earn less revenue. Corporate profits weaken. Hiring slows. Layoffs begin. Economic activity contracts across the system. The traditional definition is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. But in practice, recessions are broader than just GDP. You feel them everywhere. Job markets weaken. Consumer confidence drops. Credit becomes tighter. People become more cautious with money. Asset prices usually fall alongside economic activity. Stocks decline. Real estate slows. Risk appetite disappears. And while recessions are painful, they are also relatively familiar. Modern financial systems are built around managing them. Central banks know the playbook. When growth collapses, they usually cut interest rates. They inject liquidity into the system. They encourage lending, borrowing, investing, and spending. In simple terms, they try to restart the economic engine with cheaper money. We saw this after the dot-com crash in the early 2000s. We saw it again after the 2008 financial crisis. And we saw it on an even larger scale during the 2020 pandemic response. In most recessions, inflation also tends to fall. And that's a very important detail. Because when demand weakens, companies struggle to raise prices. Consumers pull back. Businesses compete harder for shrinking demand. The economy slows down. And inflation usually slows with it. That gives central banks room to stimulate the system aggressively, without immediately triggering another inflation problem. But stagflation changes the equation completely. Because stagflation is not just weak growth. It's weak growth combined with persistent inflation. The economy slows down, while prices continue rising, sometimes rapidly. That combination creates one of the most difficult environments in all of macroeconomics. Because suddenly, every available solution creates another problem. Cut interest rates to support the economy. You risk making inflation even worse. Raise rates to control inflation. You risk crushing economic growth even further. That's the trap. And historically, it has been an extremely painful one. The most famous example was the 1970s. After the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, economies across the United States and Europe were hit by simultaneous inflation and stagnation. Energy prices exploded higher. Production slowed dramatically. Unemployment surged. Economic growth weakened. And inflation in the United States eventually climbed above 13%. That combination shocked policymakers because the traditional economic models of the time assumed inflation and unemployment usually moved in opposite directions. But stagflation broke that assumption completely. The Federal Reserve initially responded with easier monetary policy, more accommodation, more liquidity, lower real rates. But instead of fixing the problem, inflation became even more deeply embedded into the economy. Eventually, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker made an extraordinarily aggressive decision. Interest rates were pushed toward 20%. The objective was simple: break inflation completely, no matter the cost. And technically, it worked. Inflation eventually collapsed, but the economic damage was severe. The United States entered a deep recession. Unemployment surged. Businesses failed. Housing activity collapsed. Markets suffered heavily. That was real economic pain. Now compare that environment to the global financial crisis of 2008. The crisis itself was catastrophic. Banks failed. Credit markets froze. Housing imploded. Millions of people lost jobs. But inflation collapsed too. In fact, investors became more worried about deflation than inflation. And that changed everything for central banks. Because without inflation pressure, the Federal Reserve had enormous flexibility. Rates were slashed to zero. Quantitative easing flooded the system. Liquidity expanded aggressively for years. And policymakers could stimulate financial markets without immediately triggering runaway inflation. Different crises, different rules, different policy response. More recently, the world received another reminder after the massive stimulus period of 2020 and 2021. Governments injected trillions into the economy. Central banks held rates near zero. At the same time, supply chains broke down globally. Energy markets tightened. Labor shortages appeared across multiple industries. And inflation surged worldwide. Meanwhile, economic growth began slowing underneath the surface. For a moment, markets became genuinely concerned that the global economy might be drifting toward another stagflationary environment. Fortunately, it never fully turned into a true repeat of the 1970s. But it reminded investors of something extremely important. Inflation becomes far more dangerous when growth is weak. And this distinction matters enormously for investors. Because if the economy enters a standard recession, markets usually expect central banks to step in aggressively. Lower rates, more liquidity, more stimulus. Historically, risk assets eventually stabilize once easing begins. But stagflation is different. There is no easy rescue. Stocks suffer from slowing earnings and higher discount rates at the same time. Bonds struggle under persistent inflation and rising yields. Cash quietly loses purchasing power year after year. And suddenly, traditional portfolios stop behaving the way investors expect them to. In those environments, hard assets often perform better. Commodities, energy, gold, and businesses with genuine pricing power. Because when money itself becomes less reliable, scarcity starts mattering again. So what's the practical takeaway? Watch both sides of the equation carefully. Not just economic growth, not just unemployment. Watch inflation too. Because rising unemployment combined with stubborn inflation is one of the clearest warning signs of a stagflationary environment developing underneath the surface. And if that happens, investors need to become far more defensive and selective. Do not automatically assume the Federal Reserve can solve the problem the same way it did in 2008 or 2020. The tools that help fight recessions can sometimes make stagflation even worse. That's the uncomfortable reality modern markets rarely want to acknowledge. Normal recessions are painful, but manageable. Stagflation is different. It's the economic equivalent of trying to extinguish a fire while the structure itself is already collapsing around you. And that's exactly why understanding the difference matters. Stay sharp. Watch both growth and inflation data closely. And never assume central banks can permanently protect markets from economic reality. Sometimes the institutions designed to stabilize the system become part of the instability themselves. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps support the content. And more importantly, tell me in the comments, what topic should we break down next? Thanks for watching. I'm Ledger, and I'll see you in the next one.